As cathartic as it is to have my Bowser vs. Eggman video being so well received and receiving more views than most other videos on this channel, I feel that people really underestimate how difficult it was for me to stretch the video out as long as I did. Even though it's not my first time doing it, and as you can tell, it wasn't my last. Once it came down to editing everything, it kinda started taking its toll on me. Not that I wasn't having fun or anything, it's just that I kept having to reuse clips, scour the internet for whatever negative reactions I could find. In that aspect, well, let's just say it wasn't as fun as animating the Sonic comic panels. And I knew for a fact that if I would ever feel the need to do this again, I was gonna have to do way more of that. So the only reason I would ever push myself to make an hour-long analysis of a single death battle again is if I think there's a reason for it. Enter Kratos vs. Asura. Look, I have a lot to say on this episode, good and bad. Some people might assume that the episode is only controversial because people didn't like the animation or the verdict. Oh, how I wish to be as unaware of death battle discourse as them, but I'm not. So get buckled in that car seat of yours, you James Corden act-alikes, because I'm gonna be taking you all down I-85. Kratos vs. Asura is easily one of the most talked about matchups in the dedicated community. Yes, a part of it was due to the fact that Kratos' last episode was in 2011, but the vast majority of support for this matchup was more for Asura. Further proof that niche characters can be on Death Battle and deserve to be on Death Battle every once in a while. Yeah, Asura's Wrath does have a very vocal cult following. Heck, the game's in my top 30 favorite games of all time. But people seem to forget that the game was a massive point of controversy for Capcom. People act like Wolverine being absent from one video game is the second coming of Satan. That's like a house centipede at worst. Meanwhile, the controversy surrounding Asura's Wrath was at least a planet-threatening Jiki Ninki. This game actively lost Capcom a Chakravartin-sized load of money. Between locking the game's true ending behind a paywall for reasons, and coming out just around the time people were getting tired of QuickTime events in games, it got enough negative press to be one of the biggest flops in Capcom's history. And to dump a Yoda ton of salt on the already fatal wound, Rajan Zed, president of the Universal Society of Hinduism, publicly scolded Capcom for mishandling Hindu mythology. You cannot make this up, otherwise I wouldn't be showing the article on screen. So how, in the tripled mother of facetious follies and did Asura get so popularly requested for Death Battle? Simple. Power scalers, along with the cutscenes and clips constantly getting millions of views, but can you guess what people found to be the most engaging thing about them? Though I don't really blame them because the game is nearly impossible to buy with all of its DLC, and emulation isn't a surefire option for the average person because not all computers are created equal. But it's a good thing that my name isn't the average person, and my computer is beastly enough to let me record footage in 1080p, and yes, I'm gonna be admitting to pirating the game. Look, if Capcom isn't gonna give a flying about this game, then I can't imagine a reason why they would be upset about someone playing it on an emulator, with all the DLC no less. But if they somehow care, then it can only mean they're revitalizing the IP. Otherwise, that would be a pretty bad look on their PR. Also, it's the distribution of ROMs that delves into illegal territory, and for legal reasons, I'm obviously not doing that. I'm not responsible for anyone who pirates the games themselves. Capcom, if you want to sue me, don't. Fast forward to the Death Battle community hyping up Asura and God of War's ever-growing popularity, specifically the Norse games, and more people started thinking about this idea. The Norse games do a great job of deconstructing Kratos' actions during his time in ancient Greece, without making outsiders feel like they're missing something. And similarly, Asura's journey is about dissecting his rage and how it can be manipulated and how it should be utilized. Though it didn't stop its detractors from detracting. Specifically the people who believe that the sense of scale would be neutered since Asura has cosmic fights. This was the reason why Asura has so many alts. It should be Broly, it should be Hulk, what about atrocities? I think Clive is pretty cool, personally, but that's just me. These fights could all go cosmic, and Kratos kinda couldn't. Big emphasis on kinda, as there were people who disagreed with this argument, myself included. Asura only has like, what, 2 or 3 fights that actually go into space, and only one of which involves the Destructor form, for a single phase of a fight that is also grounded for the vast majority, and even then you could argue his Destructor form is non-standard anyway. But despite everything going against it, it got enough hype and love from the community to where the majority of people got excited for it, so it was included as one of the 3D options for the 2022 Champions ballot. However, the Cole vs. Alex campaign overtook it, and it got second place. Though, this was the Death Battle team's favorite idea of the lineup. So much so that it made another showing in the 2023 Tournament of Champions, where it also got second place, because of the less dedicated but still major push for the wild tomfoolery that the winner would bring. But then DevilArtemis said, fine, I'll do it myself. And that's when we got a full-on teaser for it during the Kickstarter announcement. But then you remembered, wait, this is gonna happen before the actual winner of the Tournament of Champions. And take a guess what the reactions were like. Even if his premiere wasn't as controversial as the Green Demon or even the most forced controversy of all time, this time, a majority of the discourse surrounded the animation quality, though the contentious debate certainly didn't help. But let me tell you something, some of these people have been stuck in the discourse so dry that they resorted to public masturbation just to keep something going. And FYI, I made sure to apply extra deodorant and cologne after double washing my hair and triple washing my body, cause I knew it was bound to get stanky in everyone's leg. And I happen to have literal years of prep time and experience, though personally, I don't know if I would have prepared so extremely if it was going to be in the original season 11. DevilArtemis may have had more people helping him out, the show would have had the resources to polish that 6.5-minute runtime, and maybe those 3 cooks in the kitchen would have found their shared vision. Wait, what do you mean the episode had 3 writers? Based on my analyses of their respective writing styles, I can surmise that Joshua wrote Kratos' analysis, Herschel wrote Asura's analysis, and Ben wrote the fight. That last one is interesting because I feel that he's done a lot of experimenting in this era. I mean, I guess you gotta make the most of what you can before you're able to afford bringing everybody back, but I'd say this was the most experimental he got, even if I had been omitting a 4th writer of this episode, DevilArtemis himself. Temporarily skipping ahead, the storyboards have some differences from the final animation, with some claiming it rivals Blake vs. Mikasa and Frieza vs. Megatron in terms of how much was changed. And given his ambitions for the episode, as well as admitting to fighting for certain things to be added or removed, I feel that he had a larger push into how much was written than animators usually get. Despite all of that, the lost content from the storyboards would not drastically change my opinion of the episode. Let me rephrase that. Even if we got the best from the storyboards and the best from the animation, and if it had more polish to it, my opinion on this episode would more than likely remain unchanged. As far as covering Kratos' early journey, Kratos' analysis has an honestly incredible start. The Greek era has a larger emphasis on versus feats and calcs, which works really well to establish not just how strong he needed to be in his early days, but also how much violence he caused in Greece. This is arguably reflective of how Greek era Kratos was viewed overall, mainly as this god-killing machine, even though he still has some moments of tragedy that often got lost in the discussion. Deimos doesn't get mentioned in this part, but the episode still acknowledges that he was motivated by loss, so it's not too much of a loss. I guess I wrote it like that, sure. That said, it's weird seeing his Greek weapons getting discussed knowing that Kratos abandoned most of them and he doesn't even use them in this fight. Yet they're still relevant enough to have their attributes broken down and even have their own panel? So maybe there could have been time to mention Deimos' death. But don't get me wrong, I still think they nailed the key components of Greek Kratos, covering Ares' manipulation, how he became known as the Ghost of Sparta, his quest for redemption as well to kill every god down to the last one. It's all here. And then it's followed up with, despite Kratos succeeding in all of this, it never satisfied him. This is a perfect transition from the Greek games to the Norse games that references the empathetic side of Kratos. Their coverage helps the viewer understand that even with all of the power he's demonstrated, it does not make up who he is. And is further supported by the music subtly changing into something softer and more melancholic. And then they start going over the story from the Norse games, where they frame his second wife, Faye, as a new start, and how raising the boy would be his most difficult task. And given that the analysis previously scaled Kratos to universe busters and massively faster than light speeds, that's a really powerful framing. And his Leviathan axe was directly framed as a tool left behind by Faye to help him become better. I also really like how they repurposed the word hope around the ending. In the beginning, they say that Kratos spread hope across the universe after his godly killing spree, meaning that his rage was used as a weapon. But by the end of his analysis, they brought it back up, framing it as more as hope for the world's future, as well as his own, meaning that his rage is used as a shield. It also works as a nod to the ending of Valhalla, where Kratos realizes what being a god of hope truly means. So it's got a solid beginning and end to Kratos' analysis, but the middle has a few key pieces missing, but not the ones that you might think. The main issue people seem to have with this analysis with the fact that Atreus was never directly name-dropped, but that's not where the problem lies. Yeah, it's weird that Atreus is exclusively referred to as the boy. The analysis still made a clear effort to make Atreus feel vital to Kratos' story, mentioning how he was the most difficult task for him to take on at the start, referring to him as something that Kratos needed to protect with new weapons and relics, and referencing him one last time to show how Kratos succeeded in being a good father to Atreus. It's not like Ryuko or Gojo's analysis where their respective lack of name-dropping Satsuki or Yuji was just one part of how they were blatantly ignored. What is actually missing is how Kratos wanted to hide his past mistakes. A friend of mine put it really well when he told me that they made Kratos sound like a badass protagonist, but not as much of an empathetic protagonist. The most the analysis says on that is how he could never run from his past and how he hid the chains of Olympus in a basement. But other key aspects like Zeus's ghost and Helheim don't show up despite being perfect B-roll of his Norse journey. There are also 3 characters that would have benefited from a proper name drop, or at least a mention: Mimir, Baldur, and Tyr. Mimir does show up in a black box and a thing Kratos likes, honestly based, but he was arguably the most crucial figure to Kratos' arc in 2018. Would they need to dive extensively into it? Probably not, but simply mentioning how Mimir used his realization of Kratos' past to overcome it would suffice. Seriously, it takes a lot for Mimir to call someone a brother! Brother! Oh, you're right, the brother! Baldur probably isn't as necessary, but his role as 2018's main antagonist was that he was a reflection of who Kratos used to be. He was actively instigating the God of War's return and sought his own vengeance that was reflective of Kratos' during the Greek games. I think a quippy line from Boomstick that also featured a nod to Freya likely would have been all they needed. But Tyr's role is very simple. He was the former God of War in the Norse timeline and helped Kratos overcome his past in Valhalla. No need for a direct name drop, just an implication that he exists. And now that you see all these put together, aside from Mimir's, none of the suggestions on screen are truly big changes. And that's because I want to emphasize that Kratos' analysis is still good in my opinion. It's just that it's a few steps short of being great. Especially since Asura's analysis has the exact additions I could have wanted. Asura's analysis takes the bronze medal for my favorite analysis of Season K. The only thing that holds it back a tiny bit for me is that the editing is very basic. Kratos' analysis had more motion graphics and even a comic edit here and there, but the most editing we get here is a few visual effects over a couple clips and one motion graphic. The name drops don't get any fancy text like what we would see in later episodes, or even this one, since the game's cutscenes do that for them. It saves hours of time to work on more episodes, but doesn't look visually interesting. Though don't take this as me downplaying the analysis. I'm only bringing this up because of the standards that Death Battle has set for me before and since. The writing matters more to me anyway, and it's one of the best written character rundowns Death Battle has ever done. They do an excellent job covering Mantra and its attributes, as well as what it means to characters like August and Yasha. Oh hey, 2 goats get name dropped, God bless! And then they say how his wrath is powerful enough to hold back the planet level of Litra, but not strong enough to completely destroy it. Then they go on a quick tangent explaining what Asuras were in mythology, and okay, I'm not knowledgeable enough on this mythology to say whether or not this is an accurate description, but I can say that it's an accurate description of Asura in Asura's Wrath, where his rage doesn't stem from vengeance, but that of injustice, specifically to his daughter Mithra and humanity as a whole. Though to contrast how Atreus was framed as a hurdle for Kratos' journey, Asura's daughter Mithra was framed as a major factor of the game's narrative, saying how Mithra's power was sought by Deus, which led to the events of Asura getting betrayed by the 7 deities. The coverage of their actions further frames Asura's rage as something related to his good nature, which is then used to go into some broader feats, abilities, and other facets of his strength. This part also plays Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 from the New World in E minor, which I usually call the New World Symphony just so I don't talk with my mouth full of words. Excuse me. This is the first time since Weiss's rundown where Death Battle gets to play music from their respective series, even if it's not originally from Asura's Wrath, but I digress. His inner mantra gets discussed as how he could finally match the 7 deities in power, which nicely leads into his Berserker and Wrath forms as well as his team up with Yasha to take Deus down. And then it leads on how he could finally kill Vlitra on his own. It's also worth noting that the analysis mentions how the 7 deities sacrificed trillions of souls in an attempt to stop Vlitra, whereas Asura never needed to do anything like that. So this moment, coupled with how Asura's rage was strengthened due to his actions that protected humanity, ties into one of the themes of the game, and by extension the matchup, where anger truly stems from. where Asura's power always came from his empathy for the individual person, rather than at all of humanity's expense. Heck, this analysis even dives into that by saying how Asura's fury was misunderstood to a point where it was being weaponized by the Chakravartin. They even later say that his rage would be used as a protective shield, kinda like somebody else I know. And by this point, most of Asura's feats were capped at planet level, so they are framing Asura's protection of the Earth as something stronger than his destructive capabilities. And then they finish it off by going over the fight against the Chakravartin, bringing up more impressive strength and speed feats that were as a result of the fight, and then Boomstick says this line:
"He literally beat the QTEs out of God."
I see what you did there. And finally, they end off his analysis with Asura's sacrifice as Mantra disappears and how one simple wish to protect his daughter led to him becoming humanity's savior. Such a perfect retelling of Asura's wrath. It celebrates the themes of the game, it nuances Asura as something more than a punchy McAngry man, and it balances story and versus scaling fundamentally flawlessly. I don't think I agree with them saying Asura had partial control in his Wrath and Berserk forms, but other than that, no complaints from me here. But then again, most people don't really complain about this analysis. As for what those problems can be, well, I got an avatar to explain them for me, cause yeah, some of my avatars have different opinions from me.
Man, to think it's been over a year already since Kratos vs. Asura kickstarted the first full year of the indie era. And it was the first episode that I actually reacted to before those kind of dropped off the face of the earth. And you know what? I'm glad that at least one thing still aged from that old reaction. I'm still trans, bitches! Anyway, I know it seems counterintuitive to complain about Kratos vs. Asura in an episode that's defending it, but rewatching it, yeah, I feel this is kind of buns. Look, I will go ahead and keep this brief because everyone and their mother has talked about what this episode does wrong. The fight is where the bulk of my thoughts lie. The intro is never really explained and it's kind of wonky. Apparently Kratos is supposed to be tested by Asura, but that's never made clear. Asura is portrayed as this hulking rage machine and nothing else, despite the fact that his rundown made explicitly clear that he's more than that. The combat is really sluggish for no reason. Kratos doesn't feel like he takes any damage at all. Asura doesn't really get to do anything once he loses his arms. Instead, he pops, Wrath and Berserker forms, even though, to my knowledge, he's not even supposed to be able to access them with the Mantra reactor in his chest. And speaking of, the moment the Destructor shows up is a really cool scene. It's a fucking spectacle, especially with him bringing that fist down after he rises from behind the asteroid, but it also leads into the most telegraphed ending in the show's history, topped off with that smug-ass smirk Kratos does that I can't take seriously. And that ending dialogue exchange, I don't really know how to feel about that.
I never was a monster to begin with.
Yeah, you could have fooled me, bud. Oh, and that conclusion, it's fine, I guess, when they're actually talking about the verdict, but they have Boomstick make these quirky comments about Asura's Wrath too, and that alternate ending, oh my god, f*** off, dude. Really, I think the biggest issue with this is that it just doesn't live up to the hype. Like, what happened here? Okay, technically, I guess we know what happened, but, details, I'm not getting into that.
Hey, it's all good, bestie, that's what I'm here for.
Look, my point is, this episode was a massive disappointment. I don't know what old me was on. Probably just the honeymoon phase. Anyway, back to you, John Frost. I'm gonna go make out with my girlfriend. Goodbye!
Okay, let's see if we can address these. Let's start with the fight setup, as it's probably the most reasonable discrepancy that people had. The teaser for Kratos vs. Asura during the Kickstarter campaign was assumed to be a part of the fight itself. Looking back, it may have been a bad assumption due to the teaser having official voice lines from both games as well as official music from God of War, but this was still the only thing we saw of the episode for months, and the Death Battle team never properly communicated that it was never meant to be a part of the fight. You know how Smash Bros. Character reveal trailers come with the disclaimer that the cutscenes aren't inherently a part of the game? This Kickstarter teaser was supposed to be like that. that, but they never added the disclaimer to clarify that this was just for promotional purposes. Is it necessarily all their fault? I'd say yes and no. At the end of the day, it did use official media in places it would not be able to get away with, so there had to have been some sign that the setup was going to be different from this, but it still had some original shots and dialogue that could have stuck around. But even ignoring all of that, people still took issue with the setup, saying that it's incoherent, but I don't really believe that myself. Aside from it being unclear who summoned Kratos to Gaia, it made a lot of sense to me early on, especially as I became more familiar with God of War. This vision of Asura is supposed to be Kratos sensing that another god was pursuing him, and then when Kratos gets sent to Gaia, his fears get realized.
It's true then. The god of war is on Gaia. But not for long. We do not want this fight.
Keep in mind that Kratos' reputation has always preceded him. Every single time Kratos' cabin has been raided was due to their awareness of Kratos' actions, be it in the Greek or Nordic lands.
And here I thought your kind was supposed to be so enlightened, so much better than us, so much smarter. And yet you hide out here in the woods like a coward.
You do not want this fight.
Awesome, Ethan, I have you on fraud watch. Though due to the analysis, as well as the presence of Mithra, we know that Asura's not here to expose Kratos' rage, but Kratos doesn't know that because he was summoned by an unknown source. So naturally, due to his history with gods that tried hunting him down, it makes sense why Kratos would assume that Asura was attempting the same thing. While Mithra doesn't look threatened by Kratos, guess who doesn't know that? And also guess who wouldn't even care? Asura has such a desire to protect Mithra that he's even gone against her wishes to stand down and avoid doing something reckless. At least twice. And with Asura's preconceived notions, he feels justified in fighting Kratos to protect his daughter.
Run!
Huh. That doesn't sound like something a brain-dead berserker would do. Though I reckon some might believe the way Kratos views Asura implies that Asura is the quote-unquote antagonist of the episode. While I don't view it like this, I can imagine people being put off through this idea. It's said far too often, but an ideal canon crossover would go down differently than a Death Battle crossover. And as a Death Battle fan, this is something I've had to reluctantly accept every time I watch an episode, even if it doesn't always excuse bad characterization. But when critiquing an episode for its characterization, I try to make sure how many creative liberties I can accept and judge a combatant's characterization off of not just my knowledge of the characters, but the consistency of how a Death Battle chooses to write a character, even if I end up not liking how the episode wrote them. Going back to Kratos and Asura, I feel that an ideal encounter they would have, if it started with the fight, would lead to both getting an understanding for each other partway through, with Mithra successfully calming Asura down. And maybe a team-up would ensue somewhere down the line, who knows? Also, Asura would not use his mantra reactor to fight somebody like Kratos in his destructor form. But I can accept character oddities like this one because it comes with the territory of a Death Battle episode. That seems to be one of the only things people consistently know about the characters, so fine. Let them show the funny big giant punchy man. Go ahead. But going off of my knowledge of the characters, even if I think the fight would go down differently, I am convinced that their fight would start the way the Death Battle went about it, where Asura's limited knowledge of Kratos has him impulsively attack him, and Kratos would get the wrong impression of Asura the moment he mentions his old title of the God of War. So this setup is a relatively more elaborate misunderstanding archetype that makes sense for both characters, even if it's specifically within Death Battle's context. I think the only changes I would have made is to clarify who summoned Kratos to Gaia, as long as it's clear that it wasn't Mithra, and pick a point in time for where Asura is being pulled from, whether it's before or after his fight with Deus, or even before the Chakravartin's reveal. Even if the ambiguity were to support Kratos' surprise and misunderstanding, the viewer is supposed to have a clearer idea of what's happening than the characters. But other than that, I personally like this setup. Though once they start fighting, this leads into possibly the biggest criticism of the animation. Asura gets treated like a jobber and never pushes Kratos to fight harder. I'm very interested in knowing how else those people would interpret this shot of Asura no-selling Kratos' main weapon, or this shot of Asura getting a big punch on Kratos before he can even retrieve his axe, very slowly for some reason, or this shot of Asura catching Kratos off guard that literally causes Kratos to sink in fear, or this combo Asura gets on Kratos which lasts for quite a while and leaves a very obvious impact on Kratos once he crashes on the ground. Crashes, not lands. Or this massive explosion that Asura causes as he clutches Kratos in his arms, which leaves yet another impact that very blatantly affects Kratos. Or this other shot of Asura, once again, no-selling Kratos' main weapon. Specifically, my favorite runic ability. Screw you, dude. This isn't like Luigi vs. Tails, where Tails' damage would blink and you'll miss it. With this episode, it's close your eyes and of course you're gonna miss it. Or maybe I should say close your ears, since I do tend to hear the claim that another reason why Asura seemingly gets bodied is that Kratos doesn't express any pain grunts. Okay, so maybe the argument is that you hear Asura making way more of them?
How interesting.
But that being said, I'm willing to entertain the possibility that I'm viewing the fight dynamic very differently from the average viewer. Though, this is probably the same set of average viewers that have previously claimed that Goro and Machamp visibly and audibly reacting to their arms getting torn off apparently means they didn't react to their arms getting torn off. So maybe it could be either this community has a different understanding of damage than I, or I'm just being pedantic in my response. But let's bring up a factor that I think people heavily overlook when discussing this episode: Kratos' Spartan Rage. A key point of both Kratos' analysis, as well as the Norse story, mainly in 2018 in the Dark Horse comics, is that Kratos needed to learn how to control his rage. The comics take place before the events of 2018, where Kratos is training himself to not lose control of his rage. He practices against wild animals like wolves and bears, except those bears are actually beastmen, powered by a god they worship, and when Kratos does lose control, he essentially dominates every single one of them. Okay, let's go to the mainline games. There are a few scripted moments where Kratos goes into the Spartan Rage because he's stuck in a bind and Atreus is at the risk of death. This is how it's used in a couple fights against Baldur, who threatened to destroy their cabin with Atreus in it, lest we forget this fight where he almost did kill Atreus. And it's also used when Kratos is pinned by a horde of Dark Elves and Atreus is captured by one. Not as physically impressive, but that is quite a bit of Dark Elves. It's also used against Modi, who is openly mocking both him and Atreus, which alone doesn't cause Kratos to use a Spartan Rage, but once Atreus gets knocked out cold, that's what causes him to go into it, and he slowly but surely beats up Modi. God of War Ragnarok doesn't have nearly as many QuickTime events with Spartan Rage, the only one being against this bear, which is a tutorial boss fight to introduce the player to the mechanic and its new features. And that bear turns out to be Atreus, who was unable to control his power, but whatever. There are scenes where Kratos does get enraged, but not to the point where it activates his Spartan Rage. The fight against Heimdall is also worth noting because Kratos doesn't go into his rage mode in any of the cutscenes, despite Heimdall mocking him harder and more frequently than Modi did. Only in Heimdall's dying breath did Kratos start to lose himself, but that was only because Heimdall was pushing Kratos' patience to the moon by consciously ignoring his warnings. And even then, the Spartan Rage never popped out during this fight. Admittedly, this is making a strong assumption that the player never activated it themselves in the actual boss fights, but that's the point in both gameplay and story. It's always used in moments where Kratos has no other options or starts to feel overwhelmed by the damage he takes. And it especially hits home for me since I always use the Valor Rage during my Ragnarok playthrough. Going into the death battle, they remember to describe the Spartan Rage as a stronger form, and Asura forces Kratos to go into it not once, not twice, not thrice, but quadrice. Or is it quarce? Quince? Either way, it's 4 times, and it was entirely due to Asura's overwhelming power, something nobody in the Norse games has ever consistently done. Kratos should be well familiar with his own wrath at this point, but stating the obvious, Atreus wasn't in danger, and at no point was Asura goading him to lose control. It's exclusively because Asura's attacks were starting to feel too much for him. As for why Kratos never looks damaged in the fight, even ignoring the fact that creating good-looking battle-damaged models is overly time-consuming, I think people might be overlooking how Kratos' Spartan Rage can swiftly heal wounds. Though I'll admit showing the healing on screen would have convinced more people, but with how fast it typically happens, I can't imagine why it would be impossible to suspend disbelief. And on top of that, when Asura uses Rage to power up, it's always of his own volition, meaning that he is expressing a better demonstration of using his Rage to get stronger, unlike Kratos, who mostly goes into a Spartan Rage whenever he's in a bind. And yes, that is a valid factor of the fight dynamic because the conclusion directly uses that as a key point in Asura's favor.
And while Kratos eventually learned to control his rage, Asura pretty much always had that control.
Though I will admit it's not flawlessly handled, like in this scene of Kratos going to rage mode on his own. But to be fair, it is against another form that literally took the fight to a higher scale. So this is more Kratos adapting to Asura's power, which I think is fine. And there's also the Destructor porn, where Kratos goes into his rage mode. Wait, hang on. Did I just say Destructor porn? There's also the Destructor punch, where Kratos goes into his rage mode as he's preventing the fist from crushing him. And I'll admit Kratos does overcome it a little too fast. But I've seen people call this moment disrespectful, and I'm like, fellas, is it disrespectful to take a hit? Yeah, I'm starting to feel like this community is growing way too soft for its own good. This is not even 0.5% close to disrespect. Rather, it's just a byproduct of DevilArtemis' animation style.
And I suppose now's a good time to talk about the animation quality. And I will admit, I don't disagree with this criticism, but I would still like to add some more nuance.
DevilArtemis' animations, whether serious or comedic, often rely on fast attacks and movements, save for some key attacks. Not those. Not those. That's not even his animation. That's not even the key I'm referring to. Yes, actually. DevilArtemis has taken a lot of influence from the game's cinematography and shot composition. Screen shakes on anticipation frames? Check. Rapid fire speed and barrage attacks? Check. Isolating keyframes on the bigger hits to make them stand out more? Check. An emphasis on character acting and poses? Check-a-like-a-dingo. It's no wonder he wanted to animate this fight, because his animation style already incorporates so many aspects of that game's cutscenes. However, one of his quirks is that he can rush some smaller attacks that are meant to have more focus on an attack's impact, animating it in less frames than it should have. Granted, with the majority of the fights he animates for Death Battle, he tends to get away with it when a character primarily fights with fast attacks, or they can do plenty of cool anime shenanigans to circumvent it. But Kratos is a character where animating him has a lot less room to get away with speed running the smaller stuff, and it will sorely stick out if it's not given the precise amount of speed it needs, and that's where the real issues come into play. Let's take a look at this spin Kratos does with his blades and go over why it looks so stiff. The attack it looks to be based on has a sense of whiplash in his arms, but here, his arms are mostly locked at full extension, and despite the sound design creating the illusion that Kratos is rapidly swinging Asura around, Kratos only does one spin. This final explosion looks especially limp because instead of flicking his arms, he's just weakly rotating them up and down. Going back to the Destructor punch, Kratos prepares a stance to take the Destructor form with a confident smirk for some reason. Then he uses his Spartan Rage to catch it, and then it immediately cuts to Kratos holding it with one hand. Okay, look, if it had to be like this, Kratos should have harnessed a stronger aura of Spartan Rage, probably akin to this one right here, chuck the hand off of him, prepare the stance from earlier, and then go for a punch. As long as they add some voice lines of Kratos straining himself during the scene, it'll all feel more cohesive and less rushed. The fight does have some other valid animation problems, like the poor camera work in various scenes, and the spear going to different sizes in between shots, as well as some other moments of jank here and there. But it's scenes like this that demonstrate areas where DevilArtemis can improve. And after Cell vs. Metal Sonic, he's pretty clearly improving in this aspect, while still maintaining the highlights of his animation style. Oh yeah, and that Destructor transformation's actually really good. All of its other aspects, from the visuals, to the sense of scale, to the weight behind the motions, to Kratos' poses, vary from adequate to actually pretty awesome. Especially when Kratos finishes it off in a similar manner to how he would go about it in a Titan boss, or even Kronos, if you will. And it's the part that I really like more than most people do, even if it is mainly due to being proven right about how the Destructor form could be dealt with. And I also like the use of the spear's Artillery of the Ancients being used as another workaround. This was a clever animation choice, especially since it's framed less as Kratos outright overpowering the Destructor form, and more using the spears and Blade of Olympus to drain the mantra from Asura over time. This means that Kratos was relying less on his sheer strength and more on his versatility. Another reason why I disagree with the belief that Asura gets bodied throughout the fight, Asura is the one constantly increasing the scale. It's shown in moments like how the temple area gets destroyed as a result of Asura's power clashing with Kratos's, or how Asura's Berserker form takes the fight to what I believe is supposed to be God of War's Realm Between Realms? Or at least this part shows how the animation was able to successfully overcome one of the matchup's initial criticisms. You know, that whole scale thing. The Realm Between Realms is an infinite space that connects the realms of Asgard, so that should mean the Destructor form should fit in here just fine. But even if this was some nameless dimension, it's a cosmic location not so dissimilar to that God of War-esque environment. As for how they got there, from the looks of it seems that Asura's power tore open a rift that took them to this realm, specifically one of God of War's rift tears. I mean, both do have some extent of spatial manipulation, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was the case. But either way, the core dynamic of the animation is Asura the unstoppable force versus Kratos the immovable object. A dynamic that I would say was handled better than the last time Death Battle brought up this idea directly, because it kind of felt indecisive on who was supposed to be the immovable object. It's very apparent that Kratos is the immovable object of this fight, because Kratos has to work around Asura's unstoppable force by knowing when to use the Spartan Rage, weaponizing the environment around him, and using more of his arsenal to absorb Asura's mantra. And Asura's main win condition is based around whether or not he can plow through all of it. So in other words, yes, Kratos is pushing himself to combat Asura's continued assaults. No, Kratos is not no-selling everything Asura is throwing at him. Yes, Asura has multiple clear moments where he has Kratos on the back foot. And no, Asura does not get jobbed throughout the fight. Plus, I would argue that the Destructor form is low-key a fraud, but I don't think anybody's ready for that conversation. I do think there is an underlying issue with the choreography that I think better explains its shortcomings. But before we get into that, let's talk about Asura himself. As someone who loves Asura as a character, I've heard various people, mainly those who've never actually played Asura's Wrath or understood his story properly, claim that he has one of the worst characterizations in death battle history. Oh, wait a second, you're not wrong, huh? The logic behind this claim is that Asura is supposedly portrayed as a brain-dead berserker who's always angry, instead of someone who knows how to control his anger to protect the planet. But I don't know about you, but having played the game myself and then replaying it again for this video, I don't know, this doesn't exactly feel that out of character to me, even when he's fighting people he doesn't immediately hate. Also, no, his characterization does not contradict how the analysis frames him, nor does it go against how the game frames Asura. From beginning to end, Asura is a character who, above all else, wants to protect his daughter. His analysis frames Asura as someone who, above all else, wants to protect his daughter. The setup has Asura fighting Kratos because, above all else, he's trying to protect his daughter. He's wrathful because of his black and white outlook on injustices. And I gotta ask the death battle community specifically, because they're the ones who I've seen make this claim the most. I'm not sure if I worded this question the best though, but like, do y'all not know how anger works or something? Do I need to go over the nuances of anger? Because I just did that for a school paper for one of my master's courses, and it was specifically about Asura's Wrath, though at the time of writing this, I have no idea how I did on that paper, as the grades aren't out yet.
You aced it.
Oh, hell yeah! This is basically an A! Even though I did forget a couple citations in a few places. But I will abuse my appeal to authority on this topic. I will gaslight you into thinking I am objectively the smartest person in Asura's Wrath's academia. Y'all are seriously gonna take the words of a fucking car over someone who's actually been to school? Okay, no, that's just mean. Dailies, Mental Gym, and the daily mental patients who eat up my waffling every breakfast. It is time to talk about the ever so iconic Aristotle, the philosophy guy. Or, you know, one of them. Specifically, we are going to look at the wonderful world of virtue ethics. There are a lot of complex factors that spawn several subsets of virtuousness, but for the sake of this video and my arguments, I'll simplify it as the idea of virtuous anger, which Aristotle dubbed good temper. As it turns out, people online found so much more to explore about this concept of good temper, like with how the rational voice and irrational voice are saying the same things. What do I mean by irrational voice? Well, you know that thing you do when something bad happens and your reaction is much stronger than it reasonably should be and you don't know why? That's the irrational voice. And the appeal of Asura is that he's always speaking through his irrational voice. Yet contrary to what the other 7 deities assumed, it's also his rational voice. It's just that it gets lost in the sauce because of his poor impulse control and communication skills. His mantra affinity is wrath because he feels the suffering of the entire world flowing all over his shoulders and doesn't realize it. So he's the type of person who leaps the moment someone he cares about goes through significant suffering, but never looks at the situation before taking action. This is best demonstrated during the endgame where he rejects the Chakravartin's offer to be its heir as the ruler of Gaia. I feel like people underestimate how loaded of an ethical decision this is. Like, Asura essentially has the chance to end Gaia's suffering, which up to this point in the game was his goal, but he refuses. And this is because the moment the Chakravartin said he was gonna guide other worlds was the moment Asura assumed it was gonna cause other planets to suffer what Gaia just went through. And yet, despite the loaded decision, this is where Asura's good temper is at its most virtuous, because it's where he has the best understanding of his actions. Up to this point, he failed to understand the roots of his wrath, but having learned of the Chakravartin and its plans, he finally knows what to do with his rage. And it's the most reckless thing he does in the game. Killing the Chakravartin is one thing, but he's fully aware that he'll fucking kill himself. But he believes it's worth it just because Mithra gets to live a longer, happy life. Obviously, he considers the lives of the people from other worlds, but his daughter still takes priority, because she's the most active person in his life. And another compelling trait about Asura is that he's the type of person who puts others before himself to a fault. Selfless people in the real world still consider their own safety, but Asura very rarely does. Also, he's not that good with expressing himself through words, only actions. See Yasha constantly failing to reason with Asura through talk no jutsu. Seriously, the only way he was able to talk him down was by literally beating the shit out of him. And even Mithra had to resort to violence because Asura had no means of controlling himself at the time. Bringing this back to the death battle, given that he has an understanding of who Kratos is, all he cares about is his massive body count and destruction he caused in the Greek of Nordic lands. He knows Kratos has made a ton of people suffer and wouldn't care if he's trying to be better. His good intentions are hyper-fixating on Kratos' past and wants to take no chances. But does this mean that Kratos isn't virtuous at all? Or is even the less virtuous of the two? No. Going back to the experience category of the episode's conclusion, just replace their control of their rage with virtuousness, and it falls in line with their developments just fine. His arc is riveting because of how cathartic it is for him to not only succeed in finding the virtuousness, but to also take his past viciousness and repurpose it into becoming more righteous. And this was also a right decision because Asura was able to successfully reach eudaimonia, basically the Aristotelian word for nirvana. But remember, nobody stays perfect the moment they experience growth. Kratos and Asura are virtuous characters less because they overcome their flaws and more that they accept them. But they still aren't perfect when it comes to knowing what the right thing is supposed to be or making rational decisions. Though some might think this framing is meaningless in the context of a death battle, especially one where Asura loses. But personally, I would just refer to the matchup's connections and say that you could argue a thematic victory for either character without trampling their developments. But nitty-gritty of the execution aside, Kratos' Spartan rage actually works as some pretty solid symbolism for his character growth. He starts off being forced to use it to avoid faltering to Asura's onslaught, but eventually figures out when he needs to use it, just like how he actively tried to suppress his rage, but was forced to use it multiple times until he got the hang of when it would benefit him the most. This makes Kratos' victory feel more triumphant, but without undermining Asura's story. And I'm gonna need to get into that later in the video because that was already a lot. And for those who've never heard my waffling before, hi, welcome to my channel, where I do everything in my power as a niche micro celebrity to convince people that college is based, actually. If one can afford it. And if their advisors actually know how to tell their students how to apply their skills in the real world. And if culture war fetishizing idiots can stop steering my country into glaciers so we can prioritize a stable economy over crying over football games. Disculpe mi falta de sutileza. Pero espero que entiendan la idea principal. Es así de simple. But basically, yes, the aggressive and reckless character who's consistently called out for being aggressive and reckless by his family and enemies alike from beginning to end would naturally act aggressive and reckless in his death battle. And saying that it's out of character for him to be like that is low-key not so dissimilar to saying it's out of character for Mario to jump because he hasn't been called Jumpman since the 80s. Actually, hang on. Now that I frame the analysis like this, if the criticism is that Asura doesn't act like the demigod who uses his rage to protect the world, why would he even care that Kratos is on Gaia at all? Or at least, why would he specifically point that out? And also people say that the fix for this is that Asura is supposed to use his anger to protect people, but that rage is also fundamental to his essence. It's what makes him stronger, it's what makes him so tenacious, it's what makes him resurrect all the time. But apparently it's also out of character for him to express it? Or at least, is there seriously no way to interpret Asura fighting Kratos because he's trying to protect the world and he's using his rage to accomplish that? I'm starting to think this criticism may not have had a lot of thought put into it. In terms of how Asura fights, it's pretty on point with how aggressive his onslaughts are and how his attacks deal more visible impact on Kratos, the battlefield, or even both at the same time. And his screams and growls are as savage as Liam O'Brien's hospitalizing, blood-spilling cries of agony. You know, actually, I asked him about that at C2E2 last year, and he said that the rumors about those recording sessions making him sick are false. Or at least he was joking when he said that. Chris Guerrero brilliantly replicating O'Brien's energy is something I don't think gets nearly enough credit. His war cries are phenomenal, and when the script needs him to speak softer, he's able to reach that level as well. The only actual problem with Asura's characterization is this scene right here.
You let your wrath consume you. I have been down that road before. Shut up! Very well.
Personally, I'm still not the biggest fan of how this scene is structured. The way it's framed is more akin to the parts where Asura shuts up the opponent with a punch, or like a quick time event. Here's my pitch for how I would change the scene. If you aren't gonna read all that, just know that what this pitch accomplishes is how Kratos likens Asura to not just his own journey, but also the journey of other gods he's faced in the past. This gets to Asura because he thinks Kratos is likening him to people like Deus. Now, it better fits the reference, and even contextualizes the ending to a degree. Oh, and thanks for being happy for me, or I accept your apology. Overall, Asura's characterization is fine. A lot of his portrayal, from how he fights to his war cries to his dialogue, is perfectly in line with Asura's true character. But there is one major discrepancy that not only hinders him, but also hinders the choreography, and that's within Asura's transformations. The idea behind each of Asura's transformations is that they all come at a pivotal moment in a fight where his rage is finally able to turn the tides in a moment where Asura is visibly struggling. Not so dissimilar to how Kratos has used his own Spartan rage. In the death battle, while Asura's rage is handled fine enough, most of his transformations come after Asura takes, at most, a single big hit. Oh, so maybe that's where the jobbing criticism comes from. I will say that the 6-armed Vajra transformation is good enough. He powers into it after the burst, even if it's not in the best quality. Like, what happened here? But in terms of the choreography, the burst means he's grown stronger, which can lead into a transformation depending on who he's fighting. Okay, that one works. But that's it. That's the only transformation Asura has that actually feels earned. His mantra form especially came out of nowhere. Kratos uses his Mountain Splitter runic attack, which looks pretty devastating, but Asura casually shrugs it off and assaults Kratos with more punches. But then Kratos uses what I believe is his Whisper of the World runic ability, and then we cut to what looks like Asura dodging the blast? And then he decides to go into his mantra form? The Mountain Splitter looked like it affected him more, because Asura at least had to shrug off something that visibly hit him. This attack from Kratos looked like it dealt more damage to the wall. I mean, I guess if Kratos used something like Vince Valor's Windstorm, the jump could have made more sense, because Asura would be jumping away from the tornadoes. But then after Asura goes into his mantra form, Kratos uses spear duplicates to blow up each of Asura's individual arms with one spear toss. Couldn't have at least used Finger of Ruin somewhere? Whatever. Then Asura sees Mithra crying and goes into his berserker form. On paper, this makes sense. But this is where his mantra form should have come out, not his berserker form. And with all due respect to DevilArtemis, and for the record, I'm only calling him out specifically because this was clearly his creative choice, how do you interpret Asura's berserker and wrath forms? Because personally, given the context of those transformations, the berserker form came out when Asura had a second chance to protect something after his family was taken away, and he gravely failed. He could not contain all of the anger inside himself, and he enters the wrath form again during the Chakravartin's reveal, where he's mindlessly clawing away at his barrier. But what broke him out of it in that part, funnily enough, was Mithra. The closest Asura has ever been to going berserk due to Mithra's crying was in one of the bonus episodes, where a giant arm similar to the ones from his berserker form rips out of his skin. But he clearly doesn't go into another form entirely. After no-selling everything Kratos does pre-Spartan Rage, Asura's Destructor form also happens out of nowhere because he just nonchalantly goes into it after Kratos punches him once, which is why Asura's next line feels so flimsy.
This is not my end!
There's like a minute left, I didn't think it was. But I'll say it once more, this was just the animation rushing aspects that needed more anticipation and better flowing choreography. Not Asura getting jobbed or disrespected throughout the fight, or even Kratos dominating every exchange. That's what the storyboards did. Yeah, people like to say that the storyboards are better, but I'm here to say, no they aren't. And I'm going to go scene by scene to explain why I believe that. The setup is absolutely worse than the storyboards, no way around it. Kratos is just magically on Gaia and Asura intends to fight him because he wishes death to all gods. Look, even if the only gods he's experienced were eradicating humanity, he's clearly the type of person to judge the individual's character rather than the generalization of them. Otherwise, he'd probably be reluctantly content with Mithra's role as the priestess. Remember that Yasha was one of the 7 deities, and technically Asura never hated him, he was just upset with his actions. So you know what? DevilArtemis was right to fight tooth and nail to have this line removed. And when accounting for Mithra's additional appearance, it makes far more sense for Asura's character than just wishing death to Kratos just because he's a god. Easy point for the animation. Once they start fighting, the first scuffle is relatively unchanged. only this back and forth between them ended with Kratos and Asura punching each other Tekken 7 style, or Asura versus Yasha style if you want to be specific, as opposed to Kratos eventually blocking Asura's punches and kicking him away. This part really doesn't have any major changes of note until Kratos throws his axe. In the animation, Asura punches it out of the way instead of jumping over it like in the storyboards. And even if its animation is a little too fast, and even if it's ultimately not that drastically different overall, I still prefer the animation's version of the scene. The scene of Asura punching Kratos as he retrieves his axe is very similar, but I will give the storyboards credit for giving a better perspective of where the axe is in relation to Asura's speed. So point storyboards. The 6-armed Vajra transformation is different in the storyboards. While both are signaled with the burst icon, the boards have it appear during the struggle that splits the floor around them instead of after the temple's collapse, where it stuns Kratos and then blows him away. I personally prefer the joined events of what happens in the final animation because it better demonstrates how Asura won that exchange, but I prefer the actual transformation in the storyboards. I suppose I could take or leave either version, so point both. Asura's teleport after Kratos hits him with the pillar is essentially the same, but where the storyboards have more emphasis on Asura's dash, the animation has more emphasis on Kratos' surprise with how it lasts longer. Though this could mainly be a byproduct of going from storyboards to animation, and not inherently an advantage or disadvantage of the other. Though that being said, Asura's turnaround looks way clearer in the storyboards, so I suppose I'll give him another point. Asura's air combo is entirely an Asura showcase where he's dominating the fight, but the storyboards have Kratos magically able to get a punch out of nowhere despite not being proficient in aerial combat, only for Asura to swat him out of the sky with some punch blasts that Kratos fails to block. I give the point to the animation because it has far more impact. And this leads into the scene where Kratos starts scolding Asura, but where the final animation lets us see Kratos stand up and say his line as he gives some subtle facial animations that convey Kratos giving an actually pretty decent "he's just like me" moment. The storyboards have Kratos say it as he's off screen, which makes Asura shout at essentially nothing, and thus looks unintentionally comedic. And no, the following scene of Kratos' blades spewing out of the debris like they're symbiote tendrils is not that cool either. Point animation. However, the storyboards do have a better scene of the blades actually being used. The final animation just has Kratos doing one spin jump and then an explosion, but the storyboards have Kratos swinging Asura around the temple, where he's plowing Asura through pillars before slamming him down on the ground. But before Kratos does the explosion, Asura attempts to pull Kratos towards him with his own chain, where Kratos is forced to stand his ground, causing Asura to shoot a ton of punch blasts, where Kratos uses this as a chance to use his explosion. I'd say I generally like the storyboards' version more, so I'll give them a point. The storyboards also contain a deleted scene of Kratos using his blades to chuck some Shinkoku corpses at Asura, who swats them away and finally dashes up to Kratos for another attack, dragging Kratos' head across the floor before chucking him away. He's done this in a handful of his fights before, even against generic enemies, so I would have liked to see DevilArtemis adapt this part, and come to think of it, where did the Shinkoku corpses go in the animation? I could probably assume that they got crushed by the temple debris, but they also disappeared before that. Well, I wouldn't call that a major animation problem, though I wish this scene was included. It is a very well done sequence. Once the spear comes out, the final animation is technically similar to what was in the storyboards, but in the animation, Asura gets to go for another attack after the mountain splitter, whereas the storyboards have the spear dominating this entire part of the fight, even when Asura goes into his mantra form. The only advantage the storyboards have is that Kratos' other attack looks much more similar to Vince Voller's Windstorm given the implied visuals, and Asura's dodge is easier to see. Otherwise, I would give the point to the final animation because I think the back and forth is better. The storyboards feature another deleted scene of an armless Asura fight where he picks up the fallen Shinkoku's weapon with his teeth and gets a brief combo on Kratos, which is cool, but what happens after is very hard to tell what's going on. Kratos is thrusted into another pillar, and then he falls down, slams the floor, and somehow that causes Asura to fall down? What? Also, I'm pretty sure the 180 rule was blatantly broken here. Sadly, despite the armless Asura moment, this deleted scene isn't inherently missed by me. But it still has an armless Asura scene, so fine. The storyboards also have another deleted scene of Asura using the crumbling temple abyss to leap his way back up after thinking of Mithra, and then it leads into the destructor transformations Asura says, "This is not my end." The storyboards feature a much better utilization of this line as Asura was falling to what could have actually been his death. The final animation does have its own advantages though. Mithra being present in the area makes Asura's dash to the top easier to comprehend, unlike the storyboards where Asura gets reminded of Mithra for no real reason. Though to be fair, it wouldn't feel out of place if that happened. But the animation doesn't explicitly reach the climax of the fight since we get DevilArtemis' original animation in the Realm Between Realms. I'd say both have their advantages, but either one is inherently better or worse because of them, so points all around.
But then there's the destructor scene. Oh boy.
And people say it went out like expired milk in the animation. Well, in the storyboards, it went out like solidified milk made from the cow's piss that spent a full week rotting next to the farm's rat hole. The storyboards had the Destructor form getting a view from space as Asura proceeds to crush Kratos with his fist and then wail at him with the stand brush before punching the planet so hard it breaks on the other side. Yes, the Asura who sought to kill the gods for abusing humanity apparently doesn't have any qualms breaking the planet to kill one god he's never actually met. He may be reckless, but not this reckless. Come on. And then this leads into Kratos somehow surviving all of that, with no damage or implication that anything actually touched him, lecturing Asura on how he failed to control his rage despite the researcher's presentation stating the complete opposite on more than one occasion, and the Destructor form getting taken out in one hit. One. Where Asura crumbles, faceplants on the ground like he's a Season 1 character, and doesn't even get a final word. Give the final animation props for showing how Kratos survived the Destructor punch, along with it taking at least 3 hits to kill the Destructor form. And this is assuming that the individual spears from his Artillery of the Ancients ability don't count as separate hits, which I'd personally argue they should, especially since it's the main reason why Asura is unable to stop Kratos from approaching him, a contextualization that the storyboards' version of the kill did not have. Oh, and I'm pretty sure Kratos wasn't meant to use Spartan Rage at all here, meaning that he didn't actually strain himself to beat the Destructor form as much as he did in the final animation. The animation doesn't have a moment of blatant character assassination on Asura's end that I would argue is comparable to Aang versus Edward, possibly even worse, because the storyboards frame Kratos as the better character not just physically, but thematically as well. It's both a contradiction of the episode's premise, as well as a major reason to why this matchup exists in the first place, and a slap in the face to Asura's character arc. Aangward never felt the need to do anything like this when Ed got flanderized, just thought I'd point that out. Though when you look at the final tallies of the animation storyboards, the boards didn't end up too far behind, and it should be worth noting that I never directly said the animation was strictly better. My main point is that the storyboards did not have nearly as many improvements as some may have thought. Other comparable storyboards had deleted scenes that actually would have majorly affected their dynamics, like Megatron's panic bubble sequence or Mikasa not looking like an idiot. Kratos vs. Asura's detractors are claiming that the animation has Asura getting bodied the whole fight, and that the storyboards had significantly better back and forth. And as I've just argued, Kratos vs. Asura's changes weren't nearly as significant as Blake vs. Mikasa's or Frieza vs. Megatron's. And if there were any major changes, it would involve the storyboards having Asura jobbing even harder than in the final fight. And that's not even accounting for how DA added an aftermath to the kill. This ending was a creative liberty taken from the storyboards, and it's also been criticized for having faux emotional sincerity. Okay, so with the setup and the overall fight dynamic, I'm willing to concede that I may have an unconventional point of view. But with this ending, I just straight up think the audience didn't get it. People have criticized, or even praised the final exchange between the two, as if that's the emotional moment of the ending, but it's not. This is just Asura alluding that he wasn't fighting to kill Kratos for the reasons he believed. It should also be worth noting that because Kratos depleted Asura's mantra, this is the only time Asura gets to express his rational voice in the fight. Obviously not to a point of reaching Nirvana, but to a point where, despite his initial beliefs of Asura, Kratos still chose to let him die with dignity as opposed to pulverizing him or whatever. In other words,
Well, I guess Asura's wrath really is gone.
I wouldn't be surprised if the reference was intentional. And also, cut the line some slack. Asura had like, what, 2 seconds left to live? Can't exactly say a whole lot while on death's door, let alone when the Reaper just opened it. Nah, the emotional moment comes after, where it's played like a much more subtle version of Tanjiro vs. Jonathan's ending, and thus is a better version. As Kratos walks away, he looks behind to see Mithra holding Asura in a similar manner to the mural depicting how Kratos was supposed to die. This imagery is used to inform Kratos who she was, and to an extent, who Asura was. And given the last time he killed someone else's family member, he's disinclined to stick around this time. I'm not sure if he was meant to change his view on who Asura was. In fact, I'm pretty sure this scene is meant to be open to interpretation. But, if nothing else, he clearly pities Mithra. Is the kill dull machete worthy of 25? Okay, I guess I won't fight anybody too hard on that, but to me it's kinda better that way. The way that the scene is framed, as well as the context that, at least I've been given, having known about these characters, their arcs, and the story beats, makes the case that Kratos didn't even want to kill Asura, at least not maliciously. This feels less like an unfittingly triumphant moment, and more like a tragic cutscene you would find in one of their games. It's melancholic, it's cohesive, and it's all explained without a single line of dialogue following Asura's last words. So why are we having a discussion on DevilArtemis' harassment? And did we already have this conversation like a few years ago? Okay, there's no avoiding it anymore. I've done my crashing out on Twitter when this happened, but my other grandparent is still alive, so I don't have it in me to do it again here. That, and I've seen too much nonsense that has happened in and out of the community, and all this is telling me is that nothing's really changed. But I will be charitable and make it clear that it was far from just Death Battle fans that compelled him to leave. Based on what he said afterwards, along with anecdotes from the team, it seems that his main reason for leaving was to focus on his personal projects and experiment on his current animation style. I'd imagine he'd be willing to come back every once in a while if Ben or Chad were to ask him, at least by next year. But even outside of all that, the toxicity he's mentioned is rooted within the overall power scaling and verse debating communities, not just Death Battle fans, but the people who raged over the verdicts of various episodes and happened to take their anger out on DA, or at least just name dropped him in a derogatory way for no reason. Heck, this is why Omni Man vs. Bardock got that alternate ending, cause DA was trolling some salty sea dog who I assume hated the Death Battle episode. I do feel that, to an extent, people got caught up in the initial comment that sparked this controversy, myself included, especially since I think I found more nuance to this whole situation having ruminated on it. I don't think this community's actions have come from an inherent place of spite or hatred, but merely a byproduct of a recent power high. I've previously stated how the Death Battle debunk videos used to be the only type of videos made in response to the show. Over time, those debunks would get overshadowed by a lot of good publicity, between fans ranking their favorite episodes, reviews praising individual people on the team by name, and other facets of nuanced discussion. Also helped that the team just regularly laughs off Death Battle debunks anyway, at least the bad faith ones. And then you have Death Battle outliving Screw Attack and Rooster Teeth, surpassing its indie Kickstarter goal by almost 1,000%, and Twitter users posting hype clips of episode that regularly receive tons of traction. Earlier seasons could only dream of having publicity this good. Instead, they got the majority hyper-fixating on a few incorrect verdicts, or other special cases like what I'm just going to refer to as the power scaling / verse debating equivalent of the flat earth conspiracy. And obviously they haven't fully gone away, but Death Battle fans are at a point where they don't just outnumber the show's detractors, but talk over them. It's led to people acting more passionate about the show and what it can be that they've developed a very specific vision for what the show should be going forward. But at a cost, sometimes they'll end up shouting at the wrong people, whether or not they realize it. Between someone being perfectly civil about their criticisms of the show, people who are politely voicing their opinion, or even Death Battle fans who are pointing out a single flaw of an episode. Hey, it's an infectious power high, and I'm pretty sure it stems from a fear that everything the community has done to get the show where it is today could randomly disappear or be set back to where it was a decade ago. And for the record, I'm perfectly okay with trolling salty power scalers on Twitter. It can be really fun to watch this community beating a mongrel's ass in the QRTs. But the thing about all those common, admittedly bingo card worthy responses to them, I've received them too, multiple times. And my audience should know that I have gone to bat for Death Battle and its production team time and time again, including an impassioned critique of the most famous Death Battle debunk of all time, and in, ideally, more civilly passionate ways. I do not intend to stop doing that if I feel like I need to. But if I happen to dislike one aspect of an episode, or even fumble my wording a tiny bit, Death Battle fans can, and likely will, go after me. I will say this doesn't bother me too much, especially since I've been dogpiled on Twitter for stupider reasons. And, okay, I feel that karma might have reared its ugly head at me. I will admit that it feels weird being called a Death Battle influencer. I mean, technically I have played that role by its traditional definition, but I've started feeling like the term influencer has become more layered than I believed it to be. Every video I've ever made is ultimately an opinion piece, but I underestimated how influential they can be. We all like to use this meme to make fun of people who cite a YouTube video as a full explanation for their opinion. I've done that plenty of times myself, but I also don't think it's inherently wrong to admit that a popular YouTube video gave someone more confidence in their own opinion, or that the video worded an argument better than they could. I've seen my canon events cited every once in a while, often to help enlighten others on the climate surrounding the episode, but it also led to a multitude of comments that went after Kuro's Ben 10 vs. Green Lantern trilogy of videos shortly after my retrospective on the episode came out. I feel like all these ranking and review videos have changed how Death Battle fans view the show today, leading to what is possibly the most prominent request of any episode: do not disrespect my favorite character. In general, the topic of disrespecting a character in a death battle has made the rounds over the past half-decade. More and more cases are being made for several other characters getting disrespected by the show too, even if it's for a few small scenes or moments. There are times where I see someone make one case and, whether or not I feel as strongly, I could see how they would reach that conclusion. But other times, I feel like it can amount to people having a very poor and potentially toxic understanding of the term disrespect. Sometimes it's like, the analysis didn't talk about this one thing for this character, therefore it's disrespectful, and ignore any good characterization in the animation. Or, the fight portrayed them out of character, therefore it's disrespectful, and pretend that their analysis wasn't good. Or even making the claim of extreme favoritism to where the winner happened to get more hype moments than the loser, only to stretch that claim into insinuating that the losing character got no respect whatsoever, even if they got plenty of love or hype moments. I've even heard this accusation for characters that I know for a fact the vast majority of the Death Battle community does not know and probably would not care about if they were never on Death Battle to begin with. It gets to a point where the arguments of Death Battle disrespecting a character come less from giving constructive criticism and more like people feeling too entitled with characters or claiming an arbitrary moral high ground over a random video on the internet. It's true that everyone's character is someone's favorite, but when someone is trying to argue that a character was done dirty, it usually amounts to more subjective factors. I believe that in order for a character to be truly disrespected in a death battle, at minimum, it's required to be consistently noticeable in the analysis and the animation. If a character is poorly characterized in the fight but has a really good analysis, or if their analysis happens to be aggressively respect thread-esque or overly reliant on lamp shading, but the combatant has excellent characterization in the fight, then those conundrums would be more oversight rather than actual disrespect. So, no, I do not believe Asura was done dirty, and just in case anybody wants to argue, no, I do not think Kratos was poorly represented. And yet these accusations have gotten to a point where Death Battle team members are called out or even tagged in an attempt to pressure them into ensuring that a character gets treated the way they want. And if they believe Death Battle failed at that, well, nobody said that strong reactions to Death Battles vanished. DevilArtemis leaving came off as a culture shock to many because this seemed to be the moment where the community finally started to take notice of the rampant elitism. But then that led to them pointing fingers in the air and assumed it was just a handful of rotten apples instead of a simple case of everyone being too big for their britches. There's nothing inherently wrong with expressing passion for the characters and stories we love, but it becomes a problem when that passion turns into pressuring others to have their voices heard to a point where they end up overpowering everyone else's. Just imagine making a passion project that may even be an extension of who you are, only for so many people to actively insult that work, and maybe even you as a creative type, solely because they view a character differently from you, or because you happen to get a few things wrong, be it objectively or subjectively. Actually, you don't need to imagine that, because this is the exact mindset that those debunked threads and videos practice even today. Death Battle gets a different verdict or even slightly different scaling from someone else, all of a sudden they don't do any research at all and don't know anything about fiction. Asura has a few moments of wonky characterization or choreography, all of a sudden Death Battle hates Asura and DevilArtemis doesn't know anything about it. Those who fail to understand why we hate will warp themselves into the very thing they rage at the most. And unfortunately, I feel like there are too many people in this world, not just Death Battle fans, getting closer and closer to reaching that point. Being real for a second.
Hi. So I've received a lot of responses from my videos, some from people who love me, some from people who hate my guts. But let me just say, I don't really care about the person who gets mad at me for not liking a thing they like or vice versa. However, I do fear the person who's mad at me for ranking something an 8 out of 10 instead of a 10 out of 10.
Alright, no more bush beating. Let's just get to the question everyone wants to know. Is the scaling for both characters accurate? Well, there's no point telling you. Both characters have historically had a lot of debate over how strong they are, but it really does boil down to personal interpretation. There's a reason why the G1 prediction blog for the episode had it as a tie, and even made some revisions from the last time they made a blog for this matchup 2 years prior. Also, the prediction blog had a dedicated section to lore Kratos that really resonated with me, and I highly recommend other people to go look up the prediction blog and read that if they don't want to read anything else. But either way, that aforementioned reason is that versus debating is subjective. I know some people are adamant in that it's not, but that's either those people misunderstanding where the subjectivity actually lies, or it's just cope. Like, just cope, seethe, mauled, kill yourself. Kratos especially is infamous for the whole lore scaling meme, because a lot of Kratos' best feats involve the God of War novelizations and other aspects of the lore. And Asura's Wrath has its own conundrums, just by noticing the different calculations. The G1 blog calced the Chakravartin's destruction at around 44,000 times universal, and the death battle calced it at 91,000 times universal. The highest I've seen anyone calc this feat, by the way. But the thing is, you wouldn't even get the idea that destroying the Chakravartin stacks up to universal in any way, let alone reach thousands of times higher, unless if you did deeper digging in the game's lore. Wonder where I've heard that one before. But that said, if you really want my opinion that badly, I think that both characters are consistently hanging around ends where their stats are so close to each other that you might as well equalize them. And then at that point, it just goes down to Arsenal, and only one of these characters has versatility. And the equalized stats logic does make more sense when you view the Norse games as Kratos holding back his full potential throughout damn near most of his fights, which he evidently has, and was doing less so against Asura in this fight, so bada bing bada boom, I agree with their outcome. But just like how disagreeing with the conclusion doesn't mean it's null and void of valid points, agreeing with the conclusion doesn't mean its logic is perfect. The criticisms you've heard about this conclusion are all fair. I agree that this shot of Kratos blocking Helios' light was a poor choice of supporting footage, and Hermes having comparable speed to it should have been brought up in at least a black box. Kratos slaying Kronos does have some context that the episode should have acknowledged, even if it's not going to change their argument much. There should have been more elaboration on why Kratos scales to Freyr beyond just saying they're both warriors. All of these are valid criticisms, and I don't want to come across like they're not. Though I do think it's worth noting that they don't quite address the episode's main goal, which was to try and put the discrepancy between game Kratos and lore Kratos to bed by arguing that the claims from the novelizations are backed up in the games. In fact, I can empathize with them avoiding chain scaling to other gods for this reason, even if that is the main way you argue Kratos winning. But the problem is their lack of elaboration on how they scale the respective cosmologies. If they spent more time explaining how the cosmology in God of War is bigger than the universe in Asura's Wrath, I don't know if I would say that more people would agree with the presented research, but their logic would at least be easier for people to comprehend. Just listen to how they describe the size of the world tree in Kratos' analysis.
The tree's very existence supports all of creation among its boughs. Every strand transcending time, transcending space. Everything comes back to the tree.
The cringy-ass Versa debater in me recognizes this as them arguing that Kratos potentially scales to 5D, or low complex multiversal, because this is typically the bare minimum requirements to receive that scaling. But the conclusion never goes back to this wording and just labels it as the vagueness that is all of creation, which is normally fine, but only if there's an established size for the cosmology, like what Death Battle's done for various Marvel, DC, and Dragon Ball episodes. Also, given that much of the conclusion hinges on scaling Kratos to the primordials, why was Thanatos not mentioned once? Thanatos is a primordial, and there's no reason to assume that he would be that much weaker than Seto or Uranus. I mean, sure, Deimos was helping Kratos in the fight for about a minute, but Kratos was dealing most of the damage regardless, which included the killing blow. To me, this conclusion felt like it had a clear-cut goal, but assumed that the viewer would understand it with a shorthand coverage of the lore. And you know what? It happens. Sometimes the presented research has its problems. They've tackled lore scaling in much better fashion before and since, so I'd imagine that this is just an outlier for them. And I suppose there's a conversation we could have about statements versus direct feats, but not only have there been several other people that have pretty much taken this discussion in every single way it could possibly go, but I also like to point out that I've never really understood the hyperfixation on anti-feats for a selective amount of characters, especially knowing that Death Battle has attempted this anti-feat chicanery on multiple occasions, and every single time they were criticized by virtually everyone, even in the year 2026, and it makes no sense to suddenly start caring about anti-feats knowing this reaction. If we're gonna consciously ignore that, pretend that there are no double standards whatsoever and play the anti-feat game anyway, well, here's a quadrillion times faster than light Asura struggling to keep up with a random-ass gorilla. And here's 1,000 times universal Asura immediately getting knocked unconscious by a spaceship exploding in his face. Especially knowing that earlier, it required a large planet-sized thing to force him to exert himself so much he loses all of his arms, only to get beaten in a fight by Yasha, who, speaking of which, honestly had a much easier time making a jobber out of Asura in one of his stronger forms. Deadass, Asura put up a better fight when he lost all of his arms. Oh, and here's my favorite one. Here's Asura, in that exact same form, getting one-shot by his own daughter, who, mind you, isn't even a fighter. And yes, this was done through physical force and not through any durability negation or other kind of hacks. And that knocked out Asura for, at minimum, a full day. And it required Yasha to seek out the mantra reactor, which contains trillions of souls, and it needed to include his own just so Asura could be revived. So yeah, I can argue in bad faith with worthless anecdotes too. Y'all ain't that special. Though it's not all bad news. The conclusion lets us listen to the episode's brilliant soundtrack. Okay, that doesn't really have anything to do with the conclusion, but I really wanted to talk about the track and I had no other way to fit it in naturally. Brady is a perfect blend of the musical styles of both God of War and Asura's Wrath, with the cymbals, flutes, strings, and other Asian instruments referencing the soundtrack of Asura's Wrath, and the Icelandic vocals, bass choir, and timpani referencing the soundtrack of God of War, even using motifs from their respective main themes and arranging them in a 12/8 time signature. It doesn't just accentuate the ending with its somber tone, but many other scenes. From smaller bits like the dynamics and instrumentation subtly increasing when Asura goes into his unlimited form, the God of War choir storming in when the temple collapses, and Chick Named Deed's vocals merging with the God of War choir during the Destructor scene, Aaron clearly understood the assignment with this track. Oh, and I also forgot that there was an alternate ending to this fight, but I don't really have that much to say on it. It's a shot-for-shot remake of the final blow done on the Chakravartin, but with the ending being Kratos in the afterlife. I guess I do like the smile on Kratos' face at the end when he sees Calliope. I've heard that this model for Kratos is extremely difficult to make natural-looking facial animations, so the fact that DA was able to make several of them in the episode deserves more appreciation.
And that concludes my pitch for Asura's Wrath 2.
Wow, good job, Boomathan, you ruined the mood. Also, there's no room for a sequel. You should have said remaster, you blithering ponce. Oh my goodness, my throat is actually killing me. The video's not as long, but I have been recording for like 2 hours straight just on this video alone. And it's for one episode. Wouldn't have gone through with it if I didn't like it. It has some problems with certain animations and its presented research, and other stuff like Kratos' analysis, while good, were a few steps short of being great. But because of how well it understood the appeal of a game and character that has resonated with me for so long, the lowest score I could ever bring myself to give it is a 78 out of 100. But to be clear, I'm not speaking as someone giving pity points to DevilArtemis. Keep in mind that I'm the person that went out of my way to track down the animator of Mewtwo vs. Shadow just to address, and eventually debunk, one of the biggest urban legends in death battle history, where I received more context than I could have ever gotten and sympathized with their tumultuous situation, and I still called it a bottom 3 death battle of all time. I'm speaking as a huge fan of Asura's Wrath, who also enjoys the God of War games despite finding them kind of overrated. This didn't give me everything I wanted, and it deviated from my vision for both characters at points, but that should not be linked to feeling like anyone was disrespected. In fact, between Asura's analysis, the pseudo-narrative, and even the general fight dynamic, a lot of the core beats I wanted were still there for me, and I can't help but love it when this show is able to weave together the narrative themes with power scaling lens to create a new method of storytelling. I think this is something that we can all learn from this episode. Despite the astronomical power at play, it's not about any of that, or even the fact that this is a fight between two angry gods. Everything about these series, from the story to the characters to even the QuickTime events, every key aspect is about the opposite emotion of wrath: empathy. From Kratos slowly but surely mustering up the will to express more empathy to others, to Asura's empathy for Mithra's pain and the rest of the world's suffering, to even the player's empathy for both characters. Empathy is us at our most vulnerable, but neither strength nor vulnerability alone defines us. In fact, not even a perfect balance of both would make us unstoppable. But that balance is what grants us a life well lived. And that's a greater victory than killing a pantheon or even its creator. We tend to suppress empathy in the face of wrongdoing, but it takes real strength to express it to even those who you feel have wronged you. For better or for worse, everything we make ourselves to be it fury towards certain actions, love we express to those we care about, or even the undying resolve to either change the world or even just to see one person smile again, it all stems from empathy, one way or another, just like how empathy was always the true reason for Asura's wrath. One just has to know how to use it.
next time on Jonathan Frostathan.
Oh, and by the way, the reason why I called the Destructor form fraudulent is because it's hyped up as Asura's strongest form, yet it never fights the actual Chakravartin, only its golden avatar, which he didn't even need to beat it in the first place. Asura just beats its true form in base. The Destructor is fraudulent because my man makes it fraudulent by being himself built different!